local politics. Important information which impacts our community, nation, and world. Exposing truth, transparency, and getting to the heart of relevant issues that you just won't see in the clickbait media. And always keeping it real. It's the Michelle Tanner Podcast.
But I won't back down.
Welcome back, everyone, for episode 2 today of the Michelle Tanner Podcast. That doesn't happen very often that we get to do 2 episodes in one day, but lots of big things happening this month and this week. And this one court ruling in particular really caught my attention a few days ago, where the 9th Circuit District Court of Appeals had a court ruling, which we're going to talk in depth about here with my guest today, who is joining me via Skype. We have attorney Stanford Graham. Welcome to the Michelle Tanner Podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Michelle. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I am so intrigued. We were actually just talking offline about, I'm surprised our paths have not crossed yet because we live in the same area. It sounds like we are both very passionate about health freedom and protecting bodily autonomy and individual rights. And we saw an absolute assault, full-on violation of that during COVID in these last 4 years. And so you have actually co-founded an organization called Prosecute Now to help provide some justice and go after some of these atrocities that we've witnessed against American citizens. So I first would love for you to talk about your journey in co-founding this organization and what that has led to.
Yes, actually, it's quite directly connected with Dr. David E. Martin. I think your listeners are probably familiar with Dr. Martin and the work that he's done since about 2002. And his patent research work, and really tracking the development of what these gene therapy injections were from the beginning, even from patents as early as in the 1960s. I met David Martin after, Michelle, after listening to him on a podcast with Reiner Fulmick several years ago. And as I heard, it was actually a YouTube link that was sent to me by a friend and said, hey, you better listen to this. So I didn't know who David Martin was. I listened to it as he went through his patent explanation, actually showing the trail of patent development, IP development that really is centered with Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Michelle, it was at about 7.5 minutes into that conversation with Reiner that David made this statement: "We created SARS." And I stopped the video at that time. I forwarded it to a friend of mine. I said, we've got to do something to help this man. Now that we know, I asked him to take a listen to this and call me in a few minutes. And anyway, as it turned out, my friend that I was speaking to then said, well, I happen to know Dr. Martin. And I said, well, do you have his phone number? And he said, yeah. I said, send it to me. So I reached out to David immediately. Within 2 weeks, we were together in Utah. I had organized an interview with him to be filmed by Jeff Hayes, the award-winning documentary film producer here in Utah, really to capture a 4-hour conversation with David, telling the complete story of what we came to know as COVID-19, which had been, it's an old story in the same playbook, different chapter. So in support of David, one of the things that we found, Michelle, that was very challenging over the last 3 years is we could not find an elected official at any government level to take up even an investigation into the origins of we've always known to be a spike protein gene therapy. That's changing a little bit now, but it's been a long haul. So Prosecute Now was an organization that I co-founded with David that would give us the ability and an action plan to work with sheriffs. That would be the sharp tip of the spear to actually open murder investigations against Mr. Fauci and against Mr. Barrick.
Wow, that is fascinating and something that I think a lot of people may not actually even be fully familiar with David Martin and his work. And so maybe just touch a little bit on,
Sure.
where can people find David Martin, and are there documentaries out there that do you think people could watch to gain more insight? Because I think for a lot of people, this is going to blow their mind because, I mean, not everyone has been as involved as you and I and others have these last 4 years.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me speak to the reason for Prosecute Now and the reason I can include words like capital homicide in relationship to names like Mr. Fauci and Dr. Ralph Barrick, who's a virologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who is actually the primary instrumentality, the primary human, if we want to include him in the human race, the primary human who designed the chimeric virus and spike protein to carry it. He modulated the SARS-CoV-2 virus so that he could change its vector from a gastrointestinal virus and target it toward the heart, and then load up that bus with a spike protein to target not just heart tissue, but a specific cell called an endothelial cell, which is the inner lining of our vascular system. So the point of the injection of the bioweapon was to take out the supply chain and communication chain of the human biological system. The spike protein is directly designed to target endothelial cells, which is in effect our cardiovascular, lymphatic, and hepatic systems. It's also proven very effective at finding the weak points in biological systems and causing now, as of this year, a new cause of death for adults, which is a non-undescribable onset of death, right? The reason that we established Prosecute Now, in addition to the flagrant illegality of creating a bioweapon under the under the U.S. Code, is that in 2019, Michelle, between 2018 and 2019, in that year, Dr. Barrick and Dr. Fauci, along with the World Health Organization, were involved in establishing human clinical trials for trial drugs in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There was ostensibly an outbreak of Ebola virus there. One of the 4 drugs that was being tried on that population was something we now know as remdesivir. Remdesivir was used in those clinical trials. It had a kill rate, Michelle, of 53 to 86%, regardless of the viral load of the patients they were serving. So they knew by August of 2019, Michelle, they knew Fauci and Barrick, the World Health Organization, that established this human clinical trial using remdesivir, knew in August of 2019 that it was lethal, that it was more lethal than any pathogen you'll find in nature. And how curious it is that even with that knowledge, that became the primary drug treatment for anybody who was admitted or hospitalized, injected or not, with some kind of diagnosis of COVID-19. And so, of course, there was lots of deaths and injuries that happened as a consequence of that. So the reason that we are taking a sharp look, really the lowest fruit on the proverbial tree is Dr. Barrick, who not only who developed the spike protein that went into the gene therapy injection, but also his fingerprints are on remdesivir and its development at the University of Alabama. So the combination of those two treatments, I shouldn't call they're treatments because they're not vaccines. They're medical treatments. We can talk about that terminology specifically as it relates to the law school or the LA district.
Yeah, I definitely really wanted to touch on that case. So this was just, this is really breaking just within the last few days, or I guess it was last week now,
it came
that
out
this
Friday.
case was ruled on. So it was the Health Freedom Defense versus Los Angeles United School District.
That's correct.
And you can touch on the whole pretense behind the case, but I will read an excerpt here, which is really astounding that we finally have a court recognizing what so many of us were saying from the beginning. So the court stated in their ruling, addressing the merits, the panel held that the district court misapplied the Supreme Court's decision in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 197 U.S. 11, 1905, in concluding that the policy survived rational basis review. Jacobson held that the mandatory vaccinations were rationally related to preventing the spread of smallpox. Here, however, plaintiffs allege that the vaccine does not effectively prevent spread, but only mitigates symptoms for the recipient and therefore is akin to a medical treatment, not a traditional vaccine. Taking plaintiffs' allegations as true at this stage of litigation, plaintiffs plausibly allege that the COVID-19 vaccine does not effectively prevent the spread of COVID-19. Thus, Jacobson does not apply. That's huge, right?
It's hard to overstate the application of the proper reading of the Jacobson case in this context, Michelle. It's absolutely massive. And just to put a sharp point on the court's opinion, this is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit is regarded as a very liberal circuit. So to get this, for me, to see this opinion come out of the Ninth Circuit is very significant. The Ninth Circuit is saying that the Jacobson case was not properly applied. The Jacobson case stands for the proposition that under certain circumstances where there is a rational basis, that's the test, where there is a rational basis, the government can compel the use of vaccines in the interest of public health. And how that rational basis is established is another conversation. The PSYOP that happened here and the fraud that happened here that was intentional, the criminal fraud that happened with the pandemic, was the representation by Moderna, Pfizer, et al., that this injection was in fact a vaccine, when in fact Pfizer in its SEC filings had previously stated that this was a gene therapy. That's public record. That's what they told their shareholders, that this was a gene therapy, novel type of therapy injection, quite untested. But then they used the word specifically vaccine and actually tried to change the definition of that term so that people would line up and roll up their sleeves and be injected, because we've been trained to think that something called a vaccine is built to prevent transmission as well as acquisition of diseases. Well, the bioweapon injections, these gene modification therapies, did nothing of the sort. They neither prevented transmission nor prevented symptoms from arising. So it's a huge case. The circuit court sends this back down to the district court to make proper findings. The issue was the attempt to dismiss the case. The defendants looking to dismiss this case against the plaintiffs who had been terminated because they refused to be injected with this bioweapon at the risk of losing their jobs. And so now, with this instruction, the district court does have to arrive at this, take evidence, and arrive at this conclusion that, in fact, there is a very plausible argument that this gene therapy chimeric bioweapon never was and isn't and cannot be a vaccine. And as a consequence, its distribution cannot be compelled upon the American people. That is a massive decision.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is the CDC even went so far in 2021 to actually change their own definition of vaccine in order to try to encompass what they knew was not an actual vaccine. It was not preventing the spread. This whole lie that the American people were given by stating your children have to go to school in a mask. Your children need to receive this injection because they need to stop the spread so they don't kill grandma. It's all a complete lie. It doesn't stop the spread. At best, it may minimize symptoms in the individual, but that's not to mention the side effects that we've seen now that have been a result of these injections. So it's an absolute atrocity that this would be mandated.
We even have the admission of Dr. Birx, who stood up in front of the podiums in in the first weeks of this alleged pandemic, when they were saying that we will flatten the curve in 2 weeks, with her beautiful scarves and everything. She admitted 2 years ago that she knew at the time, when she was representing that this administration, that this gene therapy was a vaccine, standing at the podium of the White House had actually given her, and extolling the virtues of this so-called vaccine. She has admitted in public, it's on the public record, Michelle, she knew at the time that she was lying.
Wow.
She knew at the time that she was lying. We actually had that evidence submitted in the case that the team I was on that brought a case against President Biden and his administration, called Griner in the 10th District Court here in Utah, Griner versus Biden. And notwithstanding that evidence, an admission by a party opponent, in effect, by an adverse witness, that the vaccine, the so-called vaccine, was known not to comply with any kind of legal or medical definition of the same. But nevertheless, that was a representation to the people of the country and the world, so that they would comply with a plan that these technocratic oligarchs, this New World Order crowd, wanted to put in place. I'll tell you, Michelle, the World Health Organization obviously has been attempting to have a treaty ratified that would take away our legal rights over our body sovereignty, that would subjugate U.S. law to World Health Organization bureaucratic gobbledygook. The treaty has failed for the time being, but let me give you a hint about what they're trying to do. They've actually stated, and this is in publications of the World Health Organization, that the 20th century, this is a quote, the 20th century was the century of treatment. The 21st century is the century of the vaccine. The major play here is for the medical establishment, together with the funding mechanism called the government, and the research mechanism, the developers, called our academic institutions. This three-party system, the largest drug cartel in the world, is set up to profit at the expense of the American people, to profit at the expense of global citizens. And they're not afraid to kill people. That was the plan. And it still is.
Wow. So how do we, dissecting this court ruling, because obviously, this group in California of teachers who did not want to be mandated to have this injection, who brought forth this lawsuit. I mean, this was a nationwide, myself as a nurse practitioner practicing in the emergency department at the time, was removed from the schedule for stating, no, I'm not going to get an injection. That makes no sense for a breastfeeding woman to receive, when breastfeeding women weren't even part of the clinical trials. I had just recovered from COVID, which to me said, all right, I'm good. I've already clearly have some immunity. At least that's what I've always been taught in my medical and nursing training, right? Once you've had an infection, there's a level of an immunity there. So why on earth am I going to go subject myself to an experimental injection with less than 1 year of human data that doesn't even stop me from spreading something to somebody else? It does nothing to protect those around me. So, being removed from the schedule, obviously not able to provide for my family anymore in that aspect anyway, which I'm not unique. That happened to thousands, if not millions of Americans, not to mention all the military members. What recourse do we have now? Is this ruling significant to future recourse?
That's a great question, Michelle. And I thank you and all those other individuals like you who stood up and said, absolutely not doing this. The effect of this case is profound because it's the case of first impression. This is basically the first set of judges that have interpreted this 1905 case, the Jacobson case, properly. In that case, an individual was sued because he refused to receive a vaccine, the consequence of which was a $5 fine. It wasn't losing his job. It wasn't telling him that he couldn't shop in grocery stores. It wasn't telling him that he couldn't visit his family members in hospitals who were dying. It wasn't telling him that he couldn't get together with his family or friends. It wasn't telling him that his constitutional right to assemble, to travel, to speak were going to be compromised significantly at the risk of life. I'm sure you know people who have who've had their lives threatened as a consequence of exercising civil liberties. Very strange. But the effect of this case is a bright light to all the other circuits in the country, the other 10 circuits plus the DC circuit, that the Ninth Circuit is a circuit of some gravitas, that their opinion will be respected. So other district courts, federal district courts, and circuit courts will certainly look at this decision as the first time Jacobson has been interpreted correctly for a very long time.
Yeah, very, very profound ruling. So nice to see finally a court acknowledging what so many of us knew already to be true. And here in the state of Utah, it's really frustrating to see people like Governor Spencer Cox, who him and his Lieutenant Governor, Deidre Henderson, came out and were strongly encouraging and supporting businesses to mandate this shot onto their employees. Yet, there's no regard for the people who I know personally who literally died as a result of this shot. This isn't some benign shot that, sure, some people may get it and end up ultimately being okay, and that has been the case for some, but that's definitely not been the case for many, and there has been no regard from at least those in, quote, leadership in this state acknowledging that and their role in encouraging and promoting this to be forced. Because I'll say, you and I, we probably don't agree on everything. I don't agree with Sean on everything sitting over here. That there's not really one person I can think of who I'm totally aligned on everything. But what we should be able to all unite on, regardless of our stance on if we think this injection is the greatest thing, the literal gift from God that we heard from some people in this state, or if we think it's a bioweapon that's murdering people, right? All sides of this spectrum, we should be able to at least come together on the fact that this should never be forced. Good ideas do not require force or coercion, right? The fundamental freedom that we have as beings, that freedom comes from on high, not from any government, not even from the Constitution. The Constitution secures and protects those freedoms, right? That's one thing that's been very, very frustrating, is to see that lack of accountability and lack of being able to come together on all sides and at least be able to unite on bodily autonomy and freedom.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I think what a lot of us saw, what shocked me most of all, Michelle, was the unwillingness of people to read for the purpose of comprehension. There was a broad public record about this bioweapon. Anybody that had a elementary education could read the material and understand. We are looking now at other. One thing I want to say, you referred to the CDC's changing the definition of vaccine. The World Health Organization also, as you know, changed the definition of pandemic. That it is no longer, that a pandemic can be identified and called out, recognized, enforced by the World Health Organization that has no quantitative evaluative purpose. They softened the definition of pandemic to a degree that any outbreak of any pathogen that is the first time appearance in the human population would constitute a pandemic. Go to the World Health Organization's website and see what their definition of pandemic is. It's an overreach and a grasp for power to try to put into place a global acceptance of a global vaccine, so-called platform, so they can roll out non-vaccines that are gene-altering therapies by compulsion, and put and wrap the citizenry in a world of fear, so that they can for money, power, and control. This particular case in George Wentz, I tip my hat to George Wentz, who was a phenomenal litigator involved in the Los Angeles school district case, was with us on the Griner versus Biden case as well. Just a phenomenal job, those folks, to get this outcome, because now this case is not going to be dismissed. The facts are going to be heard, and it's the recognition of the bioweapon as a therapy means it cannot be compelled. Or if it could be, then there would have to be a compelling state interest, which is a very difficult boundary to cross. The other benefit, Michelle, is that that in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed a bill that went into law that protects the pharmaceutical industry from the negative consequences of the vaccines that they produce. That is, regardless of the effects of vaccines on the human population, the folks that develop that stuff have no liability. That's the 1986 Act. The 2005 PrEP Act extends that. There is a hair in that ointment in terms of the protection from liability that the pharmaceutical industry enjoys. That this case is kicking in the teeth. It's one of the consequences here, is that where there is a felony committed in the pursuit of developing, marketing, distributing so-called vaccines that are protected under these acts, the liability protection goes away. That's why we are focused on, David Martin, our team is focused on demonstrating the felonies, the crimes committed in the development, the design, the manufacture, the production and distribution of all of these bioweapon injections, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson, and otherwise. That means that every doctor that participated in administering these injections participated in the cabal to kill people. So that's what it means. It doesn't start, it starts at the top, but you saw it. You saw it and suffered the consequences personally when you lost your job because you said no. Right. Now that we have these viruses coming out, and we hear now there are these this bird flu insanity, you can bet that there's going to be an attempt like they had with the monkey pox deal, that they want to roll out a gene-altering therapy, and we're not going to have it. It cannot be compelled. That's again the value of this case, and hopefully its progeny. It opens up the gates to a lot of civil claims, and even through David Martin, we're working with the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, putting together and assembling a team to actually pursue the initial investigations, not only into fraudulent marketing of this product, but also into the other criminal activities by the likes of Mr. Barrick and Mr. Fauci.
So there is a pathway then, is what you're saying, to removing that immunity, because the other frustrating thing is we have 2/3 of Congress who are funded by pharmaceutical companies. We have, Spencer Cox, to mention him again, who is supporting mandated injections while receiving campaign donation from Pfizer. I mean, to me, that would just be such low-hanging fruit to at least eliminate these politicians from being funded by these pharmaceutical companies who are
Well,
producing these injections. It's
but
crazy that people think this is okay.
we have some very interesting facts on Mr. Cox. Under his, in the capacity of acting as governor for Utah, we have some very interesting facts on this fellow who would have had to sign a document that would allow an illegal activity such as practicing medicine without a license to the federal government and state agencies that were compelling this gene therapy. He would have had to sign off on an agreement for all those things to happen. We actually happen to know that nobody in his government drafted that agreement. It came from somewhere else.
That's a really interesting thought,
very
because
interesting.
I remember having the same thought during that time because, being a medical professional, I had people really coming after me saying, why aren't you using your platform to tell people to go get vaccinated? And I said, because I'm responsible for providing medical advice to my patients. I don't get online and blast medical advice. And it was vice versa. I never got on once and said, nobody get the shot. And vice versa. I never got on and said, everybody go get this, because that was a decision, a personal decision for the individual to be making with their own conscience, with their own research, with their own trusted healthcare provider, not a governor with no medical degree spouting propaganda while receiving financial gain for promoting that propaganda. So it was absolutely disgusting to see the amount of people attempting to practice medicine without a license and giving out this blanket approach advice with now really so far zero accountability for the most part of taking responsibility for the harm that they caused from this.
Yeah, imagine that happening. You have the illegal practice of medicine in the state by non-licensed people. And at the same time, the government was going after people like my friend Zev Zelenko, who was a licensed practitioner, who said, hey, ivermectin is a good thing. Hey, zinc is a good thing. It can solve problems. It can solve this. And him being on a hit list, a pharmacological hit list. If the chiropractors that were selling vitamin C and zinc saying if you fortify your immune system, this was an attack on the immune system. The consequences of these injections is a proliferation of very dangerous and chronic cytokines, which obviously lead to strokes, blood clots. We've seen the explosion. If you follow Ed Dowd, and the quantitative data that he has developed over the last 3 years has been astounding. But there's no argument now about what caused all the death and damage and injury over the last 2.5, 3 years, starting from the very point that this bioweapon was compelled to be injected at the expense of the loss of several liberties and the right to even care for your family.
Do you think we'll ever... Oh, go ahead. I just was going to say, do you think we will ever get true data on the effects that the shot has truly had on our population? Because, I'm concerned, A, the powers that be really don't want that actual factual data being released, but the American people have the right to know what are the facts surrounding this? What are the actual statistics? I mean, yes, we have VAERS, and we can see that there's been more, associated reactions with this than any other shot vaccine combined in history.
That's an incomplete record.
But are we ever going to actually, as someone from the quote science community, it's like, I want to see the actual data. But I fear that we never really will get that data. What are your thoughts?
I don't know if we'll ever get all of it, just because of the controls that are in place. We actually don't have to, though. I mean, there is enough data where we can derive the statistical probabilities of the data within margins of error that make statistics relevant. The other point is that in the face of any new alleged virus and any new progress that the medical community claims and that the academies claim that they're making, the citizenry ought to have in the back or front of their minds a question for any licensed medical practitioner when they suggest a therapy or medicinal or medical protocol. And for me, that question would be, did you advise your patients? Did you instruct your patients to receive the mRNA gene therapy without being fully conversant in its development and the ingredient list of what it contains? Because nobody had that ingredient list, Michelle. Nobody knew what the hell was in that tube. And to make any kind of medical recommendation to a patient of any kind of substance as a doctor, when you have no idea what is in that substance and you're relying on government institutions for cover, those days are numbered. So I think what we've seen, there have been phenomenal medical practitioners like yourselves who have stood up and said, this is wrong, we're not doing it. There's been a whole host of others that have told the line of the medical bureaucratic establishment, from the medical boards to the presidents of medical universities, to the presidents and of health insurance organizations. It runs very thick. They're all involved and participated in a RICO, a criminal RICO activity, by propounding a known bioweapon. Michelle, this is actually listed. The ingredients in the gene therapy injection are actually identified on federally regulated bioweapon lists. That's a fact. And so, very interesting collision of facts. The California case is a great step forward. Do you remember the day when the federal district court came out in its decision a few years ago saying that masks are no longer necessary in transportation areas?
That's right, yeah.
And everybody's cheering. We should have the same exuberance today. We don't have the benefit of the visibility of actually taking the mask off and telling Homeland Security idiots to pound sand. But this is as good or better of a day than that, because this strikes at the trunk, at the root of this perpetual plan to try to compel gene-modifying therapies on an unwitting or unwilling population.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you really got to the heart of the issue there when you spoke about, a lot in the medical community blindly recommending this because that's what the governing bodies were telling them to do. And it's so ingrained in training that you follow, quote, evidence-based practice. And what that really means is that you're following these organizations who are heavily funded by a handful of people, right? And you are just following and parroting whatever those recommendations are that essentially comes a lot of times from government. And it really is across the board in every industry. I've talked a lot the last few years about the little Eichmann mentality of, I know people don't like that comparison, but what did Eichmann do when he was responsible for transporting the murder of hundreds, if not thousands, actually millions of Jews, right? As he said, well, I was just following orders. It's not my fault. I was just following orders. It is the same thing across all industries when we have people perpetuating this agenda without even the full knowledge to even know why you're perpetuating this agenda, but yet, oh, I'm not responsible. I'm just following orders. I'm just doing what I had to do to not lose my job. No. We are past the point in this country of worrying about losing our jobs or livelihoods. We have to stand up. We have to do the right thing. We have to know why we're saying the things that we're saying, not just blindly following. So I thank you for, your work as an advocate, as an attorney in and co-founding these organizations to help people and help provide some accountability, where we live in a world where we aren't seeing that very often, but we can absolutely celebrate this win.
That's true, Michelle. Thanks for having me on today. I encourage everybody, crack open your mind, crack open books, do your own research. Do not rely on the words of others. Do your own research, come to your own conclusions. Your body, your responsibility.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stanford Graham. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you. See you soon.
Thanks for being a part of the Michelle Tanner Podcast. Please like, follow, subscribe, and share. And always remember to keep exposing truth.
But I won't back down. No, I won't back down.
This has been a production from a podcast studio.